Okay. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started right now. For those of you that are on the conference call line, the phone line, I've muted everybody simply because it'll make it a lot easier. But if you have a question, you can still type it in the chat window, or at the end of the session, I will open up that line so that everybody can ask questions and everybody can hear them as we go. So today's topic in our series of topics that we've had over the last couple of weeks here at Mays & Associates, this one today is going to be talking about why does a financial audit include an information systems review, or as we call it, an ISR. So we're going to go over why we do what we do and the rationale behind it. If you're in IT, some of this stuff may sound new to you. If you're in finance, it'll probably sound familiar to you, but you just aren't aware of how it applies to information systems. So as we talk about the audit process and inherent risk and things like that, you should be familiar with it if you're in finance, but if you're in IT, you probably haven't heard of some of these terms. So feel free to ask questions as we go. So our session today, Today, I'm the presenter. I'm Donald Hester, if you don't know me. I'm a certified information system auditor, amongst other things, and I'm the director at Mays & Associates for IT Audit. And so today, that's what I'm going to primarily talk about. So in this session, what are we going to talk about? Well, first thing I like to start off with is who cares? Why are we talking about this? The so what question. Then we'll talk about the scope. How do we look at the scope of an information system review? Then we'll look at the risk and material misstatement as it related to IT and how that relates to then, after that, the IT control environment. And then we'll talk about our way of doing the ISR, which is the information system review, which is our questionnaire and our report. So for those of you that are clients of ours, you will then understand why our questionnaire does what it does and be able to understand our report if you get it. Now, many of you that are clients of ours probably have already had discussions with me in the past about it, but we'll go over it here again for those that have not. So what? Who cares? So one of the things that in the last couple of decades, if you've been here for a couple of decades, you've noticed that you've gone throughout the years is becoming more and more reliant upon computers and computer systems, and even to the extent of the internet today when we're talking about cloud-based services or services that are not in your local network of your organization. So as we start to move towards using more and more technology, one of the things that we don't necessarily look at as we start to use more of this technology is the risk that comes along with it. So as we use new technologies, we should be looking at the risk related to using that technology and then devise controls to prevent that risk from being material. So the more that we use technology, the more we rely upon it, the fact that if we lose that technology also may stop operations or could halt them or make things very difficult to process whatever we normally use the computer systems for. Like if you're running checks and you don't have a manual way of writing checks, then obviously if your printer dies that is the only one that prints checks, you're going to have to figure out another way of doing it, like doing manual checks. But what happens if it's been so reliable for so long that you have forgotten how to do manual checks? So the question, so technology, we kind of just take it for granted sometimes. A lot of people have cell phones and iPads, and it just seems like no matter where you go, you have the internet. No matter where you go, you have your technology, but that's not always the case. But as our dependence on that obviously increases, then the need for security also increases. And so management within an organization, whether you're a city or a district or county or whatever, management wants to have an assurance that technology gets the attention that it deserves for those risks. And if you pay attention to the news at all, you should see that data and system breaches are almost a daily occurrence. And they probably are a daily occurrence, but what makes it to the news is only the big ones like the Target or IRS data breaches, because those ones usually affect a great number of people. If a city in Iowa had a data breach and all the citizens' information was compromised, we probably wouldn't hear about it in the mainstream media because that would be a very small breach. And there's so many of those every year that they just don't make it to the mainstream media. So when we look at things like that, the idea of caring about the risks related to the information system should come to mind. Now, we should realize that finance being one of the very first organizations or departments within organizations that started using technology, that over the years, things related to technology, whether it's a failure of technology or a breach or something like that, can affect our financials. And that is the reason why we have an information system review. So in addition to that, there's audit requirements. Some of the audit requirements, specifically a statement of auditing standards number 94, says that the auditor needs to consider the IT control environment. And basically what it's saying in that statement is that we need to gain an understanding of the IT control environment and the financial control environment and see how they relate together. And so when we look at the information systems, we need to understand those two control environments to make sure that in either one of those environments, that if there is a risk of a material misstatement, that we would catch it. So, or that actually the client would catch it. So when we look at this, and we'll talk about control environments here in a second if you're not familiar with those. But and then we have SAS 104 through 111, but basically saying doing risk assessments for the standards and looking at, and the way we do our audit depends upon the risk to the system. So as the IT auditor, I look at the risk related to material misstatement as it relates to the IT controls, and then I determine whether it's low, moderate, or high. I pass that information on to our auditors who, if it's low, they can not have to test certain areas. And then if it's high, then they need to increase their testing because the control environment, as far as it relates to IT, has some weaknesses in it. So when we look at this, it's going to gauge how the financial audit is done as well, as far as how much testing they're going to do or not do. In addition to this, it's industry best practice. It's a part of due diligence, making sure that your IT systems have the proper controls in place. And for the auditee's point of view, it's a part of proper governance. So it's something that we all should be doing anyways. So what's the scope? So when we look at things, and I always get this question because auditors do things differently here. And so I'm going to go through the rationale of why we kind of look at everything in a big picture approach. We look at all of IT. And then when we look at things at a smaller scope, some auditors will look at the financial server only, and then they'll not address anything else. There's some issues with that, and we'll go over that here in a second. So AICPA, the auditing standards, they have some definition of what a control environment is. And so I'm going to read this to you. Normally I don't want to read what's on the slide, but this is an important thing. So the control environment includes the governance and management functions and the attitudes, awareness, and actions of those in charge with governance and management concerning the entity's internal controls and its importance to the entity. The control environment sets the tone for the organization, influencing the control consciousness of its people. It's also the foundation for all other components of internal control, providing discipline and structure. So when we talk about control environment, we're not just talking about the actual little controls that you have in place, whether you have antivirus installed on machines or not. That certainly is part of it. But you see in this definition, they're also saying something about the tone at the top, right? How does management actually implement these things? How do they send the message to all employees that controls are important and that we don't need to circumvent controls, and that we make sure that we properly budget to make sure that we have those controls to address risks and lower the risks. So when you look at this definition, it's actually very broad, and it's going to be, and so when you say control environment, dividing it out into IT and financial may not be necessarily very helpful, because it really talks about all activities related to management and governance. But we talk about it in IT and finance because there's a different specialty or set of skills someone needs in order to evaluate the IT part of it versus evaluating the financial control part of it. So you have two different ways of looking at and the control environment. And so, yes, it does include both, but we do kind of look at both sides of it. The greater the financial functions rely upon those information systems, the greater the risk of material misstatement and the greater the need for information system controls. I mean, that seems logical and it follows, and it's not anything controversial, right? So if you don't agree with that, now that might be controversial, but I think most people would agree with that. So internal controls, there's different types of controls. There's the management level of controls. There is financial processing controls. Those are the controls about separation of duties, such as the person who prints checks can't sign the checks. That's a great example of a financial process control. And then you have information systems control. Examples of those would be things from like firewalls to user accounts and passwords, and the COSO, which has a framework for dealing with risk within an organization, addresses this, although it does not address IT at a very low level. It does address it from an upper management view of things. It is not silent on the issue of IT. It just doesn't get into very much detail when it deals with IT. This is where the disconnect often comes with clients, I find, is that they understand management idea of addressing risk, but they don't understand how that relates to IT. Oftentimes in IT, the IT realm, their idea of what risk is does not necessarily relate to what business risk is. What is the risk to the operations? And no matter what IT does, as an IT manager myself, whatever controls I put in place, I need to put into place because there's a risk related to something, whatever it is. What's the threat? What could happen? And it needs to take into consideration what is the business objectives and mission that they're trying to accomplish. For example, if on the last weekend of the last week of the month, you have to do a check run for payroll, and uptime is very important for the systems. This needs to be communicated to IT, so IT knows that during that period of time, the system needs to have high availability, because downtime would possibly make them run the checks late and employees not getting paid. So again, this is an example of where you have IT controls such as backups and patch management and all those other things that need to be informed by management within those other departments and what their needs are for them to accomplish whatever their mission or goals and objectives are. And so there needs to be that connect there. Sometimes that connect, I find, does not exist, but it's very important that there's communication back and forth. IT is really supporting all of their functions within a city, a state, or local government. And it's important that they understand one another so that they're protecting it in an appropriate manner. Right, and so that's kind of what that does. So I'm starting off here. This is a basic network diagram. If you've never seen a network diagram before, this is very basic. They get very, very complicated. But I just need to illustrate something here. If we look at these different network diagrams, and I'm trying to determine what the scope is for me to evaluate it so that I can understand what level of IT control environment exists to protect the financial system, the financial data from the risk of material misstatement. I need to take a look at it. So if you take a look at it, typically what you're going to look at is the finance director and the finance department's computers, and you're going to look at the back-end server that runs whatever financial application software you're running. Now, that financial application software could be an ERP and very complicated, or it can be very easy, small thing like QuickBooks. In either instance, I just need to know where that is, and then we need to evaluate the controls on those items. But in addition to that, understanding how that software works is also important, because that software may actually exist on multiple servers. There may be a database server where the actual data is stored, and there may be what we call a front-end server where the application is stored. So it doesn't really matter where. We just need to know where it is and what hardware it's on so that we have an idea of kind of how to deal with it. But here's the thing. A lot of people, when they're auditing this, will stop right there. All right, this is all I need to know. I just want to look at the server or the group of servers that are related to this. But here's the problem with that. You may have an e-commerce system. Right? So now all of a sudden I have a server in a different place that now has financial data or is processing financial transactions. So now all of a sudden that's in scope. So I can't leave that out, right? Now, a lot of times people say, well, this, that, and the other thing. Well, it's financial data, and so it may need to be addressed. What else could happen? Well, again, like we said, there may be another server that has a database that has financial information on it. So we need to look at those things as well. So now we have more than just one server that we're looking at in a network environment here. What about you print these things, right? So you print checks, print reports, print all that kind of stuff. Now, people being able to get all this information, this isn't necessarily going to be a risk of material misstatement. It may be just a disclosure of information that you don't want to be disclosed. For example, if you run checks or something like that, the server that actually sends it to the printer keeps what's called a spool on the server, and it keeps a copy of everything that it's printed, and then it typically erases it as soon as it's been sent to the printer, but it still exists on the hard drive. So this is important if you are printing anything like any HR related stuff where people's social security numbers may exist or something like that, because then that becomes a risk of disclosing personally identifiable information. In addition to that, you may scan information, and as it scans, it may go to a server, it may stay on this device that you've actually scanned. So this has happened a number of times where you've had copiers that are scanners as well, and those get sent out because they're on lease. So you get a brand new one and the old one goes, but nobody ever looks at the hard drive to see what's on the hard drive. So I think it was 60 Minutes or 2020 or one of those news investigation shows went out and actually went and checked all of these copiers that were going out, and they found all kinds of information on them. They even found paper still on the glass. In other words, some people didn't even take the paper off of it when it got sent out. And this was coming, some of it came from a local police department, and that police department had what they were able to find on the hard drive that was in the copier was all kinds of open cases that had been scanned in, and it gets stored on that hard drive and then gets sent off somewhere else in the network. So people weren't even aware that they did this. And where were all these copiers going? They were all getting shipped out of the country to be reused in other countries and stuff like that. So what you end up having is now you have disclosure of information that you probably don't want to, especially like an open case where there's going to court and stuff like that, and you're going to have PII on there, personally identifiable information, such as employee social security numbers and stuff like that. In addition to that, any financial information that's going across there. So again, that becomes an area of concern, not as much as the other areas, I grant you that, but there may be compliance issues, especially if you're dealing with credit cards, which can then become a material issue. Now you have employees, they want to get to the financial server and work on it from their iPads or from their cell phones, and now you have financial information going across the wireless network. And how secure is that wireless network? Is it sending the username and password to log into the financial system in clear text, unencrypted, as we would call it? In other words, somebody else that can eavesdrop on the wireless network, can they then use that information to then log into the server? So these become important things to take a look at. Next, what about the file server that you store Excel sheets on and all this other data that's related to financials, but it's not in the financial application? So we have some clients who they rely upon their financial applications for most things, but that financial application doesn't have the package, or the package was too expensive to do other like accruals and stuff like that. And so they use a set of Excel spreadsheets that they put up on the server to that they're then going to rely upon for their financial statements. So now that we have another area where we need to look at the controls there. I mean, is it open to the entire world? I have a friend that's an internal auditor, and he works for a county, and in that county, they had some information on a file share that should not have been shared with all of the employees. In fact, it was related to litigation, and it was open that anybody in the entire network was able to log on and see that information. So that's a material problem related to lack of controls. The controls that should have been in place should have limited the users' access to that. So that becomes important as well. Then what about the employee that wants to log in from home? Right? So they want to log in from home. Do they have a virus on their machine? You know, all these other kinds of questions that we have. Now, there's different ways of logging in. So not all of them have the same level of risk, but if they log in with a VPN, then there's generally a connection between their computer and this network as if this computer was on that network. So that means things like potential viruses and hackers that have broken into those systems can now access your systems. In fact, the target breach was related to something similar to this. It wasn't somebody working from home, but it was an outside contractor that was connecting into their systems using this type of method of connection. So these become very important methods that can lead to additional breaches. In addition to this, notice that I've now highlighted the whole thing, because now all of this data is on this network. And so your city's network or your county's network or your district's network now has information data related to financials being transmitted all across it. So now this kind of comes into scope as well. And in part, one of the reasons why this becomes important goes beyond just the fact that information is stored. We also have to look how it's being processed and how it's being transmitted. So where are all the locations that this data is? And in any of those places, is it able to be manipulated? And on the network, you can do things such as a man-in-the-middle attack. You can look at the information as it crosses the network, and then you can take that information and do things with it. You can either change it, or you can take the information and just eavesdrop on it. So what happens then if a virus gets onto this network? Hopefully your network is properly segmented with firewalls, and so that if there is a virus that gets onto the wireless network or a hacker that gets onto it, it's not going to get all the way to your financial server. One example, I mean, here's another example. What about that end user? What if they get a virus on their computer, right? Oh, and then what happens if it gets into your DMZ, or the area where you typically store your servers that are connected to the internet? What if a hacker gets into there, or a virus gets into there? Will it be able to get back to your financial server? Here's a good example. One of our clients, we went out and we do a network vulnerability scan as a part of our ISR, and when we scanned their external firewall, in other words, what the outside world would see of their particular local government, when I scanned it, I was able to find all kinds of vulnerabilities that had exploits available to them that any hacker would easily be able to take over control of some of those machines. So this became important to us. Then I found out that from that location, I could actually scan all the way to the financial server. In other words, I could actually browse to the financial server. So in that case, we then brought our scanner in and we scanned the financial server from inside the network. Because if a hacker can easily get into their servers that are hosted on the web and can get back to what we call the backend network or the private area of the network, what would they see if they scanned the financial server? When I scanned the financial server, I was able to see user accounts and passwords that were saved in plain text on the machine. So that means a hacker can easily break into the network, and then in addition to it, if they would look at the financial server, they could see usernames and passwords. So they could log in as anybody on that system. So obviously this becomes definitely a significant deficiency here, but there is a risk then of material misstatement, and it's a very easy risk, and it's very probable that if you have a system like that, that a hacker is going to find it. The question of whether they found the finance server or not, and did they do anything with it, is a different issue, but the fact that they could easily do it was an issue. So looking at these different areas of the network becomes key to understanding the controls related to the financial system, even though it seems like it's not related. Then you could have viruses on different network segments. Maybe a virus or hacker gets into the finance director's computer. That would be bad, especially if they got like what we call a keystroke logger on there. In other words, everything that person types in, they can send that information back to a hacker. So if the the treasurer, let's say the treasurer, logs into the city's bank account at Bank ABC, logs in, types in www.bankabc.com, username and password. All of that was then captured and then sent back to a hacker. This happened to a city, and it was in the news, so I'm not disclosing anything that's not generally known, where someone got this information and then transferred money out of the city's bank accounts. And some of the money was not recovered. In the person that discovered it was not the city, which this is the bad part. It was the bank. The bank discovered and said, hey, this is not normal activity for them, contacted the people at the city and said, hey, this is something bad. They were able to stop some of the transactions they hadn't completed completely, but they still lost a couple $100,000 or something like that, which for most cities, a loss of $100,000 is still going to be significant. So again, not related to the financial server, yet it had a financial impact because there was now this major loss because of something that got onto the treasurer's computer. So it's important that we have controls on those workstations too, obviously. So next area, and definitely we don't want any viruses or anything that's going to be in the server area where the segment of the network where we have the servers. This could be very disastrous because if they get on one server, they typically end up getting onto all the servers, and then they could erase things, they could change things, and then you're going to have to go back and verify that your financials are correct and that no transactions have been changed, which most people have a hard time doing, but there's ways to make it a little bit easier. What about hackers? I've just been talking mostly about viruses, but hackers are out there, and certainly they can go in there and they have different motivations for different reasons. Sometimes they just want to bring down a system. Other times they want to change things. Other times they just want to get information that they could use against folks. What about disgruntled employees? We have generally, we always kind of look at employees in finance and think, well, is there any of them that could do any types of ways around controls in the finance department? So we look to make sure there's separation of duties, but we often don't look enough at the IT folks. And it's not to say that we don't trust them, but we want to make sure there's controls and separation of duties there as well. For example, if the IT person, and here's a good example of one encounter that I'm aware of. the IT person was aware of how finance worked and who would sign the checks and how they did their batch runs. Because what they would do is they'd say, run a batch of, and this was a while ago, run a batch of checks, and here's all the checks that are going to be done. That sent the job to the server, but it stayed in a table there until they told it to execute. And then it would execute on the machine, and then somebody would go sign it. So the IT person knew that it was in the database, and so they would go into the database on that table, and they would go and modify the payees of everything so that when it actually did send it to the printer the next day, it would send it with the payee that they changed it to. Now, the finance application itself thought that it sent this check out to vendor ABC, but when the check actually got printed, it wasn't to vendor ABC. And the IT person, because they knew how the system worked, was able to circumvent some of the controls. Now, you can protect some of this stuff with things like positive pay and things of that nature. But again, it's just to illustrate that we need to make sure that we have controls in place and that proper separation of duties, even on the IT side, is important. Internal employees are obviously one of the areas where fraud oftentimes comes from. In addition to that, any outsiders that may also try to perpetrate fraud. But that's not all. Of course, we have disasters that can happen, right? Your system could die, and now you're going to have to recreate. If you don't have proper backups and you don't have a contingency plan, you're going to have to figure out, one, how to continue operations, continue to pay vendors, and continue to pay employees, even if the systems are down. How are you going to do that? And we have all kinds of disasters. Some are small, some are large. All of them play a part in making sure that operations are available, the financial system is available so that you can actually process these things and the transactions that you need to. So again, things to take into consideration when we look at the IT environment. Systems are dynamic, they're constantly changing, and they're interconnected with one another to the extent that it's really hard to just separate them all out and say, I just need to look at this one thing. In 1969, when the Information System Audit and Control Association started, everything was on a mainframe and there was no real network connectivity. Things weren't connected to the internet. You didn't have to worry about all these things. Now everything's interconnected to the point where everything's interconnected. People have refrigerators that connect to the internet. So again, it's more complicated, it's more dynamic, it's more interconnected. And so we have to take those things into consideration. And systems depend upon other systems. You're not going to get to your finance server if the network is down. So it requires the network. Therefore, there's going to be a transmission of data across something. So systems do rely upon other systems. And so when we look at the IT control environment, we have to look at the whole thing. We can't really just look at just part of it and pretend like the rest of it doesn't exist or the rest of it's not relevant. But we still have to pay attention and probably give a little bit more attention to the things like the finance server or the finance staff's workstations. So we have to have kind of both. It's not one or the other. It's kind of like both of them. Now, when we look at risk, and one of the things that we're trying to understand as it relates to this control environment is the risk that a material misstatement would happen. Not every control that's not in place is going to rise to the same level of risk. But there's two different types of risks that we need to look at. We need to look at the overall information system's inherent risk. So how sophisticated is the system? And they're not concerned about controls at this point in time. We're just concerned about the design of the environment. What type of network is it on? What type of things like how sophisticated is it? Is it multi-servers? Is it one server? How many people are going to access it? Is it only 3 or 4 people, or is it 150 people accessing the system? All of these things become part of the inherent risk. Now, if you're in finance, you're probably familiar with inherent risk and control risk. If you're in IT, you probably haven't heard these terms before. Basically, when we're talking about inherent risk, we're just talking about the risk of having this type of system in place. We're not talking about the controls related to it, like do you have a firewall that reduces the risk. The overall information systems control risk is assuming that the controls are in place as we found them to be in place. What is the risk now? And we're specifically looking for the risk of material misstatement. I'm not necessarily concerned about the risk of disclosure of information not related to financial information. I'm not concerned with the network crashing and the police department not being able to use their radio systems. Again, because it's part of the financial audit, I'm looking for the risk of material misstatement. And so that's part of something that's important for people to understand, because sometimes they think that, oh, it's an IT audit. We had an IT audit. Well, you did have an IT audit, but we weren't looking at it as if we were doing an IT audit. We do those things, and when we do those things, it's a completely different scope. We have a different goal in mind. We're not just looking for the risk of material misstatement. We're looking for the risk of something that would negatively impact some type of material threat to the overall operations of the organization. And it's not just the financial operations. So things to look at. And we look at the IT control environment and the financial reporting control environment, and we're looking for risk of material misstatement. And that's what this little graph down here is kind of illustrating. The IT control environment is not completely related to the financial control environment. The financial control environment is not completely related to the IT control. There's an overlap. For sure. And in that overlap, we're looking for the risk of material misstatement. We're looking for those types of risk. And obviously, all of IT is not related to that, but we don't necessarily always know what it is until we've looked at everything. So and this risk is different than a regular IT risk assessment. We do those as well, but that's a completely different thing. When we do an IT risk assessment, again, we're looking at the risk to the organization. When we do it as a part of the financial audit, we're looking at the risk related to material misstatement. So that makes a big difference in on the way we conduct the scope and the way we conduct the review. And then also our findings, because our findings are going to be prioritized based upon the risk of material misstatement, whereas in an IT risk assessment, they're going to be related to the risk that you're going to be able to be hacked, or there's going to be an exploit, or some threat will be able to execute. So it's a different type of thing, and the report would be completely different. So again, we're really concerned with financial statement accuracy. That is the purpose of the audit. That is then as a part of that, the IT, the information systems review part of this. That doesn't mean that IT staff doesn't need to address all the other risks and that finance shouldn't help them or whatever, because our review is only looking at the information asset of one type, financial data. We're not concerned about everything else. But the city or the county or the local government, whatever you are, needs to be addressing the risk related to the entire system as well. So when we look at the internal control guidelines, which these came out in 2005, the California State Controller's Office came out with internal control guidelines for California and local agencies. And if you look at those, you will find that it actually specifically talks about, at a high level again, IT controls. And they specifically mention it a number of times. And why I'm bringing this out here is because there is this emphasis once again, at looking at the IT control environment and making sure that its risks are being addressed as well. And then they talk about information processing, and they talk about two aspects of it: applications controls and general IT controls. And if you go back to what I just showed you in there, the application controls are talking about the controls and the financial application themselves, and the general IT controls are talking about everything else. Now, the interesting thing about this is 2015. This comes out and says, hey, you should be doing these things. Mason Associates, we've been doing this for 15 years. We were kind of trendsetters on this because we were already looking at application and general IT controls. One of the reasons is because we have a certified information system auditor, me, on staff who looks at this, who have been trained in the IT side of things, but also in the audit side of things. The problem is when you have a financial auditor who comes in and looks at IT controls, they're probably going to make a mistake. One of the things that I ran into when I first came to Maze and when they first did it in the year 2000 is regular financial auditors would go and they'd ask questions of the IT staff. And they would say, okay, how often do you change your passwords? On their checklist, for whatever reason, I don't know who did this, it said, I think it was like one of those checklists that you get from PPC or someplace like that. The checklist said they should change the password every 60 days. So they would ask the question, how often did you change the password to the IT person? The IT person would say, we change it every 30 days, or we change it every 90 days. And then the financial auditor would say, well, that's not 60 days, so I'm going to give them a recommendation that should be every 60 days. Okay, so here's the problem with that. It's not that simple. How often you change the password is going to be related, one, to the risk of the system that's in question, and two, how complex your password is, right? So if your password is more complex, the less often you have to change your password. If it's a very simple password, like only 3 characters or all numbers or something like that, then you need to change it more often. And here's the thing, I would not give a recommendation for somebody who changes their password every 30 days. That's actually a stronger implementation of the control than the 60 days, which seems to be industry norm or whatever. So I'm not going to write them up and give them a recommendation because they're not doing it every 60 days, because they're actually doing it better. In fact, I'm not even going to write them up if they do it every 90 days, because it really just depends upon how complex their password is. And if their passwords are complex and they're changing every 90 days, then again, it's not a material risk that we're dealing with here. The issue is they are not trained in what it means in IT, so they have no idea. They have no clue looking at it. A good friend of mine who's an audit client, an IT manager, he's lamenting to me last time I talked to him that their city has a rule that they have to change auditors every so often, and so they're going to be changing. And he says, last time we had IT auditors that came in here, they didn't know anything. I could have told them anything. I could have told them that, our warp core is in the trans warp drive, and that's how we back it up, and they wouldn't know. And here's the problem. If they're not skilled in what they're auditing, they really shouldn't be auditing it. And we'll get to that at the end, because that becomes an important thing. Again, like I said, you have to look at the application controls and the general IT controls. We've been doing this for a long time. It's just now really kind of surfacing up to the point where they're saying, hey, auditors, you kind of have to look at these things, because that's what those local governments should be doing, looking at application controls and general IT controls. So again, unfortunately, it's taken 15 years to get to this point, but I'm glad to see that it's there. So what controls should you guys be following when it comes to IT? You get the internal control guidelines, and they don't give you specific controls. They don't tell you need to have a firewall. They don't tell you need to have antivirus. Where do you find out that you need to have these things, right? Well, here's the problem. For local governments, you're in a unique situation. If you're a publicly traded company, you don't have this problem. They have controls, and they will tell you what they are, with Sarbanes-Oxley and other things. But if you are in local government, it's voluntary. So it should be risk-based, and it's voluntary. Now, they have a cybersecurity framework that was developed by the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, and it was based upon Executive Order 1363-6 that came out in 2013, and there's a version of it out there that you can find that tells you, hey, you can do this. The problem with this standard, again, is, and here's the issue, is it's high level, and it doesn't get down to you need to have a firewall. So how do you get from this high level standard down to the point that you need to have a firewall, right? We'll get to that here in a second. So requirements for those IT controls, like I said, there's no required standard for local governments. There's required standards for federal governments. There's required standards for publicly traded companies. There's required standards if you process credit cards. So even if you're a local government and you process credit cards, there are requirements for that. And then there's what we call industry best practice and due diligence. Here's the thing. If industry best practice is to have a firewall, and you say, well, we're not required to follow any IT standards, we're not going to have a firewall, guess what? If something happens and something bad happens and someone breaks into your systems and it goes to court for whatever reason, they're going to look at whether you were practicing due diligence. Were you following the best practices of industry? And you're going to have to say, no, you weren't, because best practices is to have a firewall and antivirus. So in addition to that, not only do you just have industry best practices, but it's been recommended for you. So National Institute Standards of Technologies have special publications that are their guidelines for implementing IT controls. And they say state, local, and tribal governments, as well as private sector organizations, are encouraged to consider using these guidelines as appropriate. What does this really mean? This means that if you deviate from this best practice, you should have a risk-based reason for doing so. Otherwise, you're not practicing due diligence, which is a legal term and has legal consequences. All right, so let me say that again. It's not required, but if you don't do it, you better have a good reason for not doing it. So what is this called, this NIST Special Publication 837, and how does it relate to that cybersecurity framework we talked about earlier? This is known as the Risk Management Framework. The federal government is required to follow these things, and again, state, local, and tribal governments and private organizations are encouraged to consider using them. I don't know how to say it. Strongly encouraged. Also, if you get federal funds, this may come into play, so you might want to take a look at this. Also, you may already start to feel the sting of this because your system, if you're a local government and you have police force, and the Department of Justice has guidelines for the part of your network that connects into their systems, and those are following these same control catalogs, the same controls that we're talking about in NIST. So the Department of Justice says your police department has to connect to our system, and you need to have these controls, and we might come and audit them, and all of those controls that they're giving you are based on this risk management framework. So even though you're not necessarily aware that they exist, it's already creeping in if you haven't already done so. So what NIST has done, because they have these two things, they have the cybersecurity framework that just recently came out, and then they have the risk management framework. They're saying, hey, these things work in conjunction with one another. It's not one or the other; they both work together. And what the cybersecurity framework is just a recent attempt, really, to address the lack of concern for cybersecurity for everybody else other than the federal government. The federal government already is required to do these things, but there's other organizations out there that are like local governments and such, and industry verticals such as the power industry, so everything like power lines and all this kind of stuff, or sectors in other types of energy like fuel and stuff like that, that they have different types of risks, but they want to make sure that they give them something that they can start with and start moving towards the risk management framework, because even though it's not required, again, they want to kind of push you in that direction. So the cybersecurity framework is really kind of like an entry point to get people going in the direction of the risk management framework, which is the more full functioning actual IT governance process that NIST has. Now, there are other standards out there. There's COBIT, which is developed by the Information System Audit and Control Association. It's been around for a very long time. If you're familiar with Sarbanes-Oxley, it aligns perfectly with that, and most corporations will use that as their standards. You have to pay for that, not much, but you do have to pay for that standard to get it. This standard is free of charge, and you can download these and start working with them. And there are hundreds of documents that go around these core documents that support, like, what should I have? It's not just that I have to have a firewall. Great. How do you set one up? How do you make sure that it's, what's the rules for setting one up? Well, they have a special guideline just for that. So they get down to the lowest level and to help your IT staff figure out what they need to do. So looking at these two frameworks and how they kind of overlap with one another, we don't have to get into it here, but just to know that they're kind of looking at the same thing. When you say categorize or identify on the cybersecurity framework or categorize on the risk management framework, what we're really talking about here is identify what your information assets are, and then figure out what controls you need to put in place to protect those from whatever risks exist out there. You need to have some type of way, you need to implement those controls. You need to assess those controls, make sure they're functioning as you thought they were. And then you need to be able to detect if something has gone wrong. So continuous monitoring. You need to be able to respond to that and recover from any type of accident that happens with it. Risk management framework's doing kind of the same thing. It has an extra step in there, and that is that management has to authorize the system. IT puts the controls in place, and some third party comes in and looks at the controls and says, yes, IT properly is representing the way the controls are in place. And then somebody in management, like city manager or something like that, would then say, I'm signing off on this, that IT can go ahead and operate these systems as these controls are in place. So yes, it's much more formal, the risk management framework, but it follows proper governance and really is management's buy-in on this. In the federal government, the authorizing official, the person that signs it, is legally responsible for that system. If something happens to that system and they should not have authorized that system to be in production, they can be fired, they can be put in jail. There's pretty stiff fines related to it. Again, that shows the importance of this. I don't know of anybody that's actually in the federal government that has been put to jail for that. I know people have lost their jobs over things, but I don't know of anybody that's actually been put to jail, which is unfortunate because it leads people to think that you don't have to take this seriously. I'm a fan of, putting people out in the stocks in the middle of the town square, I guess, because I wish somebody would be, so that people would take this seriously, so that we can actually address some of these risks and people take accountability for putting systems in place that really should not have been put in place the way they were. So NIST has special publication 853. It's on revision 4, and it is what we call a control catalog. In other words, it's a list of all the controls that you should have in place in a regular IT systems. They group it by family. They give you a description. They give you guidance. There may be some enhancements for it. They give you references to where you get more information about it, and then they tell you what the priority for this control is. Priority is really important because the priority is based upon actual hacks that have happened, the controls that haven't been in place that would have prevented things like the Target breach or the IRS breach. And so the priority list is constantly changing. In fact, it just changed January of this year. So 853 revision 4 changed in January of this year to change all the priority codes to match what real attacks are happening now. In addition, they have like a baseline, and the baseline is just like, is your system a low system, a moderate system, or a high system? And that's all based upon what type of data you have on it. And so some controls are not appropriate for a financial system because it's not a high level or high risk system according to NIST for overall operations of an organization. Now, how does this relate to the cybersecurity framework? So the cybersecurity framework is very deceptive. It looks like it only has a few controls, like 80 controls or something like that. So you look at it and you say, okay, we have to protect the information. So we have to set up access controls. And so the first one is we have to set up identities and credentials, in other words, passwords, usernames and passwords, to manage users and devices. And then we have to have physical access control as well. Great. So that sounds like it's really simple. Here's the thing, if you look over to the right-hand column over here, it's referencing this special publication 853 revision 4, and it's telling you what controls actually meet this particular control in place. So in other words, what we're saying is the cybersecurity framework is telling you and pushing you back to the NIST controls. So if you just put the NIST controls in the first place, you don't have to deal with all this other gobbledygook. I really think it is an example. This is my opinion. It's just extra bureaucratic nonsense. But hopefully it makes it easier for people to implement these things. But again, it's pointing you back to the same thing that you could have already done in the first place. Anyways, I don't know. I don't know if it's really going to help or not, but here it is. It's pointing you right back to the other things. Now it says, in addition to this, you'll notice that it lists other types of controls like COBIT and ISO, which are other industry standards that are used. COBIT mostly for publicly traded companies, ISO mostly for European-based companies and stuff like that. Same type of control as NIST Special Publication 853. Difference, you have to pay for both of those to get them. You're not required to follow them. If you follow NIST, you're following pretty much the same types of controls. There's not really controls that are in NIST that are not in ISO, and there's not really controls in NIST or ISO that are not in COBIT. There's usually a crosswalk between all the controls. Anyways, so for me, again, the cybersecurity framework is just a new thing. It's more to me like a gimmick and not so much as a fully enhanced standard like NIST is or ISO or COBIT. And again, if you're doing ISO, COBIT, or NIST, this has become superfluous. So why would you be concerned with it? So our questionnaires, the way we divide our questionnaires up, we look at the application controls like we talked about in the internal control guidelines that just came out this year. So if you're a client of us, you know that we've been doing this for a number of years. Again, that we predate what they've done here. Then we have the general IT controls, which are our information systems questionnaire, and then we have compliance-related things, which is related to payment card industry. So if you're processing payment cards, there are guidelines that you need to follow for that as well. So here's our website, kind of shows you where our questionnaire is. And if you're not a client of ours, sorry, maybe one day you will be, and then you play with it. Questionnaire breakdown, we have two different types of questions. We have the control questions, and that's to determine the control risk. But then we have demographic questions that aren't related to that, like how many servers do you have, how many IT staff do you have, how many workstations in finance do you have. This helps us determine that inherent risk that we talked about before, because I need to understand inherent risk, and then I need to understand the control risk, and then I need to give that to the financial auditors so that they can determine if they need to test more transactions or less transactions. So that's why we have demographic questions. A lot of people ask me, like, why are you asking those demographic questions? Why does it matter how many servers I have? Well, it does, because that changes what your inherent risk is. Here's an example of some of those inherent questions. Inherent risk questions or dynamic or demographic questions. Again, it's very simple. It's just like, how many total IT staff do you have? What's the total number of servers they support? This is good information to know too, because sometimes I can compare all the different cities and local governments and districts and say, okay, they have X amount of servers, and most other cities, same size, have that many servers, usually have this many IT staff. Are they understaffed, right? Other groups do stuff like this. There's a group called MISAC, that the Municipal Information Systems Managers Association. I just butchered that probably. Anyways, they do the same types of things as well. So the information is out there available regardless of whether I have it or not. But this is just our questionnaire, again, for us to look at the demographics. And then for each of the controls, we look at each one of the controls, and guess where we get the controls from? NIST, the NIST Special Publication 853. We're currently using revision 3. We haven't gone up to revision 4. There's not a whole bunch of controls that change, so it's not a material. None of those controls that have changed are material, so it's changing for next year, but we'll be up to date next year. Each control we look at, is it in place, is it not in place, is it partially in place, is it not applicable or risk accepted? Now, in place or not in place is pretty easy. If it says you have to have a firewall, is it in place or is it not in place? Right? Do you have a firewall or not? That's an easy question. Partially in place is a little bit different. When it says, one of the controls says that you have antivirus, that the antivirus is centrally managed, and then it's automatically updated. If you have antivirus and it's in place, in other words, installed and everything, it's centrally managed, but it's not automatically updated, then you would mark something that is being partially in place, because you're not meeting the standard, you're meeting it partially. You've done some of it, but not all of it. And the reason why we mark it as partially in place is because really you should implement it as being fully in place. In other words, you're fully following what the standard says. But we give you credit for it because there's different maturity levels in IT management, and so we understand that. And so if something's partially in place, we will just note that it's partially in place, and then I'll tell you about the report here in a minute. If it's not applicable, for example, it says you have controls for your wireless network. If you don't have a wireless network, it's not applicable, right? Because the control is if you have a wireless network. Going back to the example of a firewall, if you are not connected to the internet, which I doubt that that's the case, but if that were the case, then the control of having a firewall is not applicable because you're not connected to the internet. Now, most everybody is, so it is going to be applicable. And then risk accepted. Now, this is the one that is really interesting, because a lot of folks will go through this questionnaire and say, well, we don't do this one, but I think it sounds a lot better if I say risk accepted. Well, here's the thing. There are some controls that you can't risk accept, or that I, as an auditor, deem unreasonable. If you're going to risk accept something, you need to have a risk-based reason for doing that. It should be documented and as a part of your risk assessment process in IT. I find that most cities, local governments don't have that process documented. If you do, great. But if you say that you're not implementing a control because you know the risk and you've accepted the risk, then it needs to be documented. You cannot at risk accept not doing backups. Right? So somehow there has to be some type of way of recovering the system. And if you don't have it, you can't risk accept that. because it needs to be done. That's just like a no-brainer. Not changing passwords ever, you can't risk accept that, because the control is in place because someone, if they discover the password, could use it in the future. Well, if you change it every often, if they discovered it, then they can't use it in the future. How else are you going to get around that if you're not? You can't just accept that risk. That's too great a risk. So depending upon what you put risk accepted, you really should have a risk-based thing, and management needs to accept that risk. They need to fully understand it, and they need to accept it. And as an IT manager, I would never accept the risk. I would push it up to somebody else, like city manager or something like that, make them accept the risk, because as the IT director or manager, I don't know what their mission is and how that would affect their mission. They need to understand how that would affect their mission, them accomplishing their goals, and whether or not they are willing to accept that risk. For example, if the IT manager says, well, we'll back things up on the finance server, once a month. Well, if you ask the finance director, okay, do you want to recover a month's worth of data? They would probably say, no. I don't want to have to go back and spend a whole month keying everything in there, so I would want to have it more often. So again, this is where you don't want the IT folks doing it, and the IT folks don't want to be doing it. It is the finance director, whoever's in charge of whatever we're talking about, wants to make sure that they accept the risk, because it's their functioning department that needs to be able to function. So things to consider with that. So our findings, we're almost done. Sorry, I'm running a little over, but our report. So in our report, we report all of this stuff. So we talk about what the overall information system's inherent risk is. And inherent risk you really can't change unless you change the way your system is. So if you have X amount of finance staff and you have X amount of this, it's just not going to change unless you change that. In other words, you have less staff or less. So even if it's high, it's not the end of the world. But if it's high, you need to have better controls. Right, so it all plays a factor in what you do with the controls. And then the overall information system control risk, we look at that. We do a vulnerability scan. We may do some other testing from time to time, in addition to looking at the questionnaire and seeing how many controls are in place, how many are not in place, which controls are. Some controls are more important than others when it comes to risk of material misstatement, not for your system as a general. Again, because remember, our focus is just on the risk of material misstatement. And so when we look at all of that, including the inherent risk, we're taking this from industry standards. We're not, or the Information System Audit and Control Journal actually talks about inherent risk and how to determine what inherent risk is, and we just use what they have in place. Auditors can use their own judgment in this, but we find that it's better that we use something that is in a peer-reviewed journal rather than something that's just off the cuff. And again, what we're looking for is something that's material. We want to know, and sometimes materiality is really easy. Well, most of the time it's really easy in finance. Sometimes it's very hard in IT. And it's just because, again, these systems are interconnected, they're dynamic, they're constantly changing, and we don't necessarily know the full ramifications of this particular control not being in place, how it could end up being directly related to material misstatement. So we can kind of look at things at how they would affect the organization as a whole. We can kind of look at what types of irregularities or errors are we expecting. Again, if it's a legal act, then we're going to be much more, if it could lead to an illegal act, then we're going to be much more interested in it. But again, sometimes it will be much more difficult for IS auditors than financial auditors. However, we have the same requirements that we need to give the criteria for our recommendations. In addition to that, currently we do an external vulnerability scan. We may not be doing those next year, not sure, but this is just one way for us to do testing to kind of see how they answer the questionnaire and does it line up with what we've done. When we do an external test, and here's the rationale behind it, we're testing your externally facing computer systems. In other words, what the rest of the world sees. If we find that there's patches that have not been patched in years, we have a problem, because if you're telling me you're doing your patch management and then I do a scan and then I find that you're not doing your patch management, okay, then there's an irregularity, right? So we got to do some more testing. Well, so then I look at all the scan and see how many things are not patched and how long has the patch been available for those systems. It tells me about their configuration management. It tells me about their patch management, their how they deal with risk. It tells us a number of things when we do this. And sometimes if we find, like in that one example, where it's open such that hackers can get in and then get into your system, then it becomes much more urgent, right? So we look at those types of things to kind of look at those. When you get a scan, which by the way, you should be doing your own anyways, this is like a base control that everybody should be doing. The fact that we do one and we give it to you is great, but that's not enough. You should be doing these things weekly, preferably, but no less than monthly. The higher the severity, the more urgent it needs to be remediated. So if it's severe, critical, or urgent, urgent being the highest level, it needs to be dealt with. You can't exist. There should be an exerted effort to get rid of anything that's an urgent level vulnerability that you have on your system, because that means it's easy for a hacker to get into your system. So you don't want to have that. Then next part of our report, we talk about our findings and exceptions. So we will note any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. In our report, if we have any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, you're definitely going to have a phone call from me, and we're going to have meetings about it, because we need to make sure that we fully understand how the system's working. We need to fully understand and make sure that you fully understand why this IT issue is now all of a sudden a material weakness or significant deficiency for the financial audit. Generally, this is a big deal. And so if you're worried about those types of things, if you never hear anything from me and I just send you the report, you don't have anything to worry about. But if we talk about material weaknesses, significant deficiency, there's going to be discussions happening as soon as we find it, because part of it, what we have to do, the criteria that we have to meet when we document a material weakness is going to require us to go back and forth and ask questions, and because there may be other controls that exist that will prevent this IT control from becoming a material misstatement. So if it's a material weakness or significant deficiency, we're going to have a conversation about it. So and then you can ask all your questions. Otherwise, it's just on to other matters. Now, we highlight under other matters any control that's related to the financial reporting that we think has a moderate or less risk, more like low-level risk of affecting misstatements within the financial systems. So things like you don't change your password often enough, or you don't change your password at all, or it's not complex enough on your financial application, well, this is going to be a recommendation. It's going to come under other matters. We don't think it raises to the significant deficiency or material weakness. In other words, it's not a high risk, but it is something that you probably should address. Now, it can become a growing concern if after year after year after year we continue to report it and you do nothing about it, then it can become a growing concern. In other words, the risk is growing because management doesn't seem to think that it's important. So what I'm saying about other matters is that you should not ignore them. You should deal with them as soon as you can, even though it's not getting to the level of material weakness or significant deficiency. By the way, for the IT folks in there, those are legal terms. They're terms that mean that it's very bad. Best way to put it. And if you have those types of things, that means that our audit might have exceptions. And if our audit has exceptions, you may lose federal funding. So yes, it's serious if it's a material weakness or significant deficiency. So you don't want anything to rise to that level. Under other matters, then we have another one where we just say, hey, all those other controls that you put partially in place, not in place, or partially in place or not in place, you should address those. Either do a risk assessment, determine that you don't need to have the controls, and then change the questionnaire next year to risk accepted, make sure it's documented. But all those other controls, you should work on fixing those. Granted, all those controls are not a concern for me for risk of material misstatement, but they should be a concern for your local government, because those things are things that are known to, if they're not in place, lead to hackers and viruses and loss of data, violation of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the system and the data within it. So this is, in this one particular question here, or this one recommendation, sometimes causes confusion because they're like, well, what do you exactly mean? I mean, anything that you're not following the standard for, you should be doing. Or you should do a risk assessment and determine that you don't need to do it. So pretty much it's like a catch-all. It doesn't rise to the point where it's an issue for the audit, but it's something that I would be remiss in not informing management of these issues. Management should look at these things and say, okay, IT staff, how are we going to implement these things? Now, you may say, well, we want to use COBIT or ISO instead of NIST for our control catalog, and yours is based on NIST, and that's fine because every one of the NIST controls directly relates to one of the ISO controls. So if it's not here, it's probably not there. So even if you're following ISO, you still need to be doing these things. Like having a firewall, well, guess what? It's in all three. Maybe it's not specifically addressed, like in COBIT, it may say you have to have proper network segmentation, but under proper network segmentation comes firewalls. Anyways, so it's all there. And so we put in the appendix how you answered the questionnaire, so that finance and IT are both aware of how the questionnaire was answered on both sides. And there's no like, oh, I didn't know, you didn't know. Everybody knows where everything is. Other factors, and this is one of the last things I have, and this is just, again, we kind of alluded to this at the very beginning, and making sure that the auditor knows what they're doing. And again, it scares me to death when I hear that financial auditors are going out there and trying to do IT audits because they're not equipped to do it. They don't understand how the IT works. They don't understand the interconnectedness, the dynamicness of it. They don't understand how general controls within IT work. They can answer a questionnaire and say yes or no, but they wouldn't know if a IT manager was buffaloing them. In fact, I went out one time and I asked a question. And the question was, and I shouldn't tell you this, guys, because now you guys are going to know how to lie to me. Anyways, so I went out there, and the IT director tells me, he says, yeah, I look at the audit logs every day. And I don't, for whatever reason, I'm like, well, what do you mean you look at the logs every day? Now, financial auditor would have just said yes and moved on to the next checkbox. So I said, well, what do you mean you look at them? He says, well, I print them out, and they're sitting right over there, and I can see them right now. I looked at them today. Well, that's not what we mean by looking at audit logs every day. Right, but again, it took that extra question or that next step to do that, which sometimes are not folks that are not qualified to do it would not get it. So there are primary certifications that they should have, and GAO actually recommends that 65% of the audit staff that is doing IT audits is a certified information system auditor. So again, it's a recommendation; it's not a requirement, but if they're going to recommend it and they're going to pick a specific standard, like they're going to say you need to be CPAs, then you should probably think that that's important. So if they say you need to be a certified information system auditor, flags should go up, and you should say, okay, industry standard. This is, again, it's one of those things, due diligence. If you're not doing this, why are you not doing this? Right, so this is the thing that you want to look at. So now there's other types of security certifications out there, like a Certified Information Systems Security Professional, CISSP. Very good certification, but I've seen a lot of them try to do audits, and they don't understand audits. They don't understand sampling. They don't understand inherent risk. They don't understand those things because those are audit-specific things that are related to financial audits, and so they don't know that. They're very competent in IT security, but they just don't know how an audit works, and so they have a tendency to either over audit or under audit, and that could be dangerous. If they under audit, it could be bad, and if they over audit, it's just a waste of time and money. So you want to make sure that they're understanding it, and that's why a CISSP is not listed as one of those certifications that GAO recommends for audit staff. And they also put in there that you could have a graduate degree in the subject as well. Now, if you're a certified information system auditor, it requires a graduate degree, just like a CPA requires a degree. So CISA, if you don't know what it is, it's very similar to a CPA. You have to have a degree, you have to have work experience, and you have to pass the exam, and you have to have continuing education. It's considered a professional certification just like a CPA. So again, you should be looking for that whenever you have auditors that are looking at information systems. So with that, is there any questions? Let me unmute everybody on the conference line. And then if you guys have any questions, go ahead and either type them in or take yourself off mute and put it in there. I'm putting in here in the chat window the survey. So if you want credit for this, for CE, go ahead and fill out that survey. And at the end, there's a question that says what you want your name to be on the certificate and all that. Make sure you fill that out and make sure we have an email address for you so that I can send it to you. Any questions? Wow, I answered everybody's questions. That's awesome. just to let you know, if you're typing or anything like that, it looks like somebody's typing. While I'm waiting for that to come in, just to let you know, we have upcoming classes. September 2nd, we have a fraud prevention class. And if you go to mazeassociates.eventbrite.com, you can sign up for that class as you signed up for this one. And we'll have some more classes coming later this year, but they're going to be geared more for nonprofits. And then we'll start back up in the spring.